Hollow Ridge was a small town, surrounded by dense forests and mountains that seemed to watch over the inhabitants with a threatening air. During the day, the place had a bucolic beauty, with fields golden from the sun and peaceful streets. But when night fell, especially in the autumn, Hollow Ridge changed. The wind seemed to whisper ancient secrets, and the treetops swayed as if responding to something invisible. On that particular night, the wind wasn't the only thing moving. Something was approaching, and everyone in town seemed to feel it. The sensation of being watched grew like a weight in the air. The ravens were the first to notice. Rachel Harrington was in her kitchen, cleaning the dinner dishes when she noticed a group of ravens perched on the fence in her yard. She lived on the outskirts of town, near the forests, and the ravens were nothing unusual. But there was something different about them. Their eyes glowed brighter than usual, as if reflecting a distant fire. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, they just watched her. "How strange," Rachel murmured, feeling a chill. She closed the curtains, but even so, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. At that moment, her phone rang. It was Ben, her older brother, who lived a few blocks away. "Rachel, are you hearing this?" he asked, bluntly. "Hearing what?" "The ravens. They're screeching like crazy here. And the sky. There's something strange in the sky." Rachel slowly opened the window. The ravens were still there, but now they emitted a low, hoarse sound, like a lament. When she looked up, she saw what Ben had been mentioning. The clouds, once ordinary, were stirring, forming slow and disturbing spirals. There was something in them that seemed alive. "Ben, do you think this is?" Before she could finish, a loud rumble echoed through the town, a deep sound that seemed to come from within the earth. The ravens took flight at once, covering the sky like a living shadow. Rachel dropped the phone, her heart racing. The night had just begun. The people of Hollow Ridge were practical but superstitious. The town had its legends, like any other small community, and many of them involved ravens. They said that when the ravens flew in mass, it was a sign that something terrible was about to happen. But those were just stories to scare children. At least, that's what Rachel thought. The next morning, the air was dense. A thin fog covered the town, and the sound of the ravens still echoed in the distance. Rachel decided to find Ben and try to understand what was happening. He was one of the forest rangers in the area and spent a lot of time exploring the more isolated parts. If something was wrong, Ben would know. On her way, Rachel noticed how uneasy the people were. Some residents looked at the sky, murmuring to each other. Others stayed inside their homes, windows closed as if they were waiting for a storm. When she arrived at the ranger station, she found Ben examining a map. "I knew you'd come," he said, without looking at her. "What's happening, Ben? Does this have to do with the ravens?" He nodded, pointing to the map. "We've had reports of something strange in the forest, near the North Trail. Ravens acting aggressively, people hearing sounds they can't explain. And yesterday, during my patrol, I found this." Ben opened a drawer and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. When he revealed it, Rachel saw something that made her stomach turn, an amulet made of bones, with raven feathers attached to it. The feathers were stained with what looked like dried blood. "Where did you find this?" she asked, horrified. "Near the dead tree, at the end of the trail. I didn't want to believe it, but I think something is happening. Something ancient." Rachel knew exactly what he was talking about. The dead tree was the center of one of Hollow Ridge's oldest legends. They said that years ago, a group of locals had performed a ritual there, trying to summon something to protect the town. But the ritual went wrong, and something was left behind. Something that should never have been awakened. Rachel and Ben decided to investigate the dead tree. They knew it was dangerous, but they also knew that ignoring it wasn't an option. With lanterns and machetes, they entered the forest, where the fog was thicker, and the ravens flew in circles above their heads. When they reached the dead tree, they felt the air change. The temperature dropped, and an absolute silence took over the place. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Around the tree, there were symbols drawn on the ground, made of ashes and feathers. In the center, a small hole seemed to pulse, as if something was trying to emerge. "This isn't natural," Rachel whispered. Before Ben could respond, a low, guttural sound echoed from the tree. It was like a scream, but filled with an ancient pain. From the hole, a shadow began to rise, taking the form of a gigantic raven with glowing, lifeless eyes. Rachel recoiled, but Ben stood frozen, hypnotized by the creature. "Ben, get away!" Rachel shouted, but it was too late. The shadow enveloped Ben, and he let out a scream that made Rachel cover her ears. When the shadow dissipated, Ben was lying on the ground, lifeless. But his eyes were now as black as the abyss. Rachel ran, her legs shaking, and her heart pounding. She knew this wasn't the end. Something had awakened, and it was only just beginning. In the days that followed, the town descended into chaos. The ravens were no longer just a sign. Now they were a direct threat. They attacked residents, broke windows, and left disturbing messages in the streets, symbols drawn with blood and feathers. Rachel tried to warn the authorities, but no one believed her. Only a few older residents seemed to understand what was happening. One of them, Mrs. Evelyn, was known for her stories about the ritual of the dead tree. Rachel visited her in search of answers. "You've opened something that should never have been touched," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "The raven is a messenger, but also a watcher. It's here to claim what was promised long ago." Rachel asked how they could stop it, but Evelyn just shook her head. "You can't stop the raven. You can only survive it. But you must close the hole before it consumes everything." Desperate, Rachel gathered a small group of residents willing to help. They returned to the forest, armed with improvised tools and the knowledge Evelyn had given them. But what they found there was worse than they had imagined. The dead tree was now alive, its branches moving like tentacles. The hole in the ground was larger, and from it, shadows in the shape of ravens were emerging. In the center, the giant raven waited, its eyes glowing like black stars. "We have to close it," Rachel yelled, but every movement was a challenge. The shadows attacked, and the giant raven seemed to read their thoughts, anticipating their moves. Rachel knew there was only one way to stop it. Evelyn had mentioned that the original ritual required a sacrifice, and she was willing to offer herself. While the others fought the shadows, Rachel approached the hole, holding the amulet Ben had found. "If this is what you want, then take me," she shouted, throwing the amulet into the hole. The giant raven let out a scream that made the earth tremble. The shadows retreated, and the hole began to close. But as it did, Rachel felt her strength being drained. She knew she wouldn't survive, but she was at peace with it. Her sacrifice would save the town. When the hole finally closed, the raven disappeared, and the forest fell silent. The ravens were gone, and peace returned to Hollow Ridge. But Rachel was never found. The surviving residents told her story as one of a hero who faced the shadows. But sometimes on autumn nights, when the wind blows through the town, you can hear the sound of wings flapping and a distant lament. They say the raven is still there, waiting for its next opportunity to fly. And when the sky closes upon us, everyone knows that the night of the raven may begin again.